August 1067 AD. The sun rises over the bend of the Niger River in West Africa, and merchant caravans stretch as far as the eye can see. 500 camels loaded with gold bars, salt blocks, ivory tusks, and silk cloth win through the gates of a city whose towers gleam in the desert light. The call to prayer echoes from the Grand Mosque. Scholars in flowing robes debate mathematics in the courtyards. Children run through markets bursting with goods from 3 continents. This is Gao, capital of the Songhai Empire, the richest city in the world at that moment in history, and I guarantee you never learned about it in school. They told you Africa had no history before Europeans arrived. They told you black people built nothing, created nothing, achieved nothing. They told you slavery was the beginning of the African story in the Americas. Every single word was a calculated lie, and today, that lie dies. In the next hour, I'm going to shatter everything you were taught about African civilization, about black history, about where your ancestors came from, and what they built. You're going to learn the names of kings who controlled more gold than any European monarch. You're going to see evidence of universities that existed while Europe was burning witches. You're going to discover cities that were architectural marvels, while London was still a muddy medieval town. And you're going to understand exactly why they erased all of this from every textbook, every curriculum, every history lesson you ever received. Because here's the truth they couldn't let you know. If the world understood that black Africans built empires that rivaled Rome, how could they justify enslaving millions of Africans? If people knew that African scholars were teaching advanced mathematics and astronomy, how could they claim black people were intellectually inferior? If anyone discovered that African kingdoms controlled global trade routes and accumulated massive wealth, how could they explain why black communities today have almost nothing? The erasure of Gao wasn't accidental. It was absolutely essential to white supremacy. And understanding this one city, this one empire, this one moment in history will unlock the truth about wealth, inequality, educational disparities, and systemic racism that persists right now in 2025. Your ancestors didn't start as slaves. They started as emperors, and it's time you knew their names. By the end of this video, you'll know the real story of the Empire of Gold. You'll know the names of the warriors who defended it. You'll know exactly how European powers conspired to destroy it. You'll see the 4-step system they used to erase it from history. And you'll understand why learning this truth today, right now, is an act of resistance and reclamation. This isn't ancient history that doesn't matter anymore. This is your history. This is your stolen inheritance. This is the foundation of every injustice your family has faced for generations. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. Let me take you back to a world that was deliberately hidden from you. Let me show you the Africa they never wanted you to know existed. Gao sits on the eastern bend of the Niger River, in what is now the nation of Mali. The city was founded sometime around 670 AD, which means it's older than the University of Oxford, older than most European capitals, older than the concept of England as we know it today. For centuries, Gao served as a crucial trading post, but its true power exploded in the 11th century when it became the capital of the expanding Songhai Empire. Now let me paint you a picture of what this city actually looked like, because Hollywood and your history teacher both lied to you about what African civilization was. Gao wasn't a collection of mud huts and dirt paths. The city sprawled across both banks of the Niger River, connected by a sophisticated system of boats and ferries. The population at its height reached somewhere between 85,000 and 100,000 people. To put that in perspective, that made Gao larger than London in the same time period. London in 1100 AD had about 15,000 people. Paris had maybe 25,000. Gao had nearly 100,000. The city was laid out in districts, each serving specific functions. The royal quarter contained massive palace complexes, built from stone and sun-baked clay bricks. Some buildings standing 3 stories tall, with elaborately decorated facades. The Grand Mosque of Gao dominated the skyline, a stunning example of Sudanic architecture, with its distinctive wooden beams protruding from the walls, like the quills of a porcupine. The merchant quarter buzzed with international commerce. The scholarly quarter housed schools and libraries where students came from across the Islamic world to study, and everywhere there was gold. Gold coins in the markets, gold jewelry on the people, gold decorations on the buildings, gold dust used as everyday currency for small purchases. One Arab traveler named Ahmad ibn Umar wrote in his journal that he saw gold being used so casually in Gao that some wealthy families literally used gold leaf to decorate their roof tiles. He wrote, and I'm translating from the original Arabic here, "This city possesses more gold than Baghdad, more learning than Cairo, and more wealth concentrated in one place than I have witnessed in all my travels from Al-Andalus to Jerusalem." Think about that for a second. More gold than Baghdad, which was the wealthiest city in the Islamic world at that time. More learning than Cairo, home to Al-Azhar University. And this was written in 1067, before Gao even reached its peak. Where did all this wealth come from? Control of trade routes. Gao sat at the intersection of the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, the Niger River Trade Network, and the East African trade connections. Caravans carrying gold from the mines of Bambouk and Buri in the south would stop in Gao before continuing north across the Sahara to Morocco, Libya, and Egypt. Salt from the Saharan mines of Tagaza, literally worth its weight in gold in sub-Saharan Africa, flowed through Gao. Ivory from forest elephants. Slaves captured in warfare, yes, because every society in this era participated in slavery, including Africans enslaving other Africans. We have to be honest about that. Textiles from as far as India, glass beads from Venice, copper from North African mines. The Songhai Empire that controlled Gao developed its own currency system, using both cowrie shells for everyday transactions and gold dinars for larger purchases. They established a standardized system of weights and measures so that trade could be conducted fairly. They built caravanserais, which were basically medieval hotels where traveling merchants could safely store their goods and rest. They created a legal code governing commercial disputes. This wasn't primitive barter. This was sophisticated international capitalism happening in Black Africa in the 11th century. The archaeological evidence backs all of this up. UNESCO declared the tomb of Askia, located in Gao, a World Heritage Site in 2004. This pyramidal tomb stands 17 meters high and was built in 1495, but it represents architectural traditions that go back centuries earlier. Excavations around Gao have uncovered the foundations of large stone and mud brick buildings, sophisticated pottery iron tools of high-quality glass artifacts from North Africa and the Middle East, and Chinese porcelain that somehow made it all the way to West Africa through Indian Ocean and trans-Saharan trade routes. Let me give you specific numbers, because specificity matters when people have spent centuries claiming this didn't exist. Researchers estimate that the Songhai Empire, with Gao as its capital, exported approximately 9 tons of gold annually at its peak. 9 tons per year. That's 18,000 pounds of gold flowing out of West Africa through this one empire. At today's gold prices, 9 tons of gold is worth about $540 million every single year for decades. And that's just the official trade we have records of, not counting smuggling or private transactions. The empire's army numbered around 100,000 soldiers at its height, organized into units of cavalry infantry and a navy that patrolled the Niger River. They weren't fighting with sticks and stones. Archaeological finds show they had iron-tipped spears, iron swords, quilted armor that could stop arrows, and later would face enemies with early firearms. But Gao wasn't just about military power and economic wealth. It was a center of Islamic learning that rivaled any city in the Muslim world. The city had multiple madrasas, which were Islamic schools, and a major mosque that served as both a place of worship and a university. Scholars taught the Quran, Islamic law, Arabic grammar, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and history. Students came from as far as Egypt, Morocco, and even Al-Andalus in Spain to study with the masters of Gao. One of those scholars, a man whose name you should know, was Ahmad Baba al-Timbukti, though he was more associated with Timbuktu, which was part of the same empire and connected to Gao. Ahmad Baba owned a personal library of 1,600 books at a time, when the largest library in Europe might have contained a few hundred volumes. Think about that. A single black African scholar owned more books than most European kings. The private libraries of Gao's elite collectively contained tens of thousands of manuscripts on every subject imaginable. These weren't just religious texts. We're talking about mathematical treatises that included advanced algebra, astronomical charts tracking the movements of planets, medical texts describing surgical procedures, historical chronicles documenting the reigns of kings and the outcomes of battles, poetry and literature, legal commentaries, even erotic literature, because yes, medieval Africans had sex lives and wrote about them. Shocking, I know. The existence of this scholarly tradition completely destroys the racist myth that Africans had no written culture, no intellectual tradition, no civilization before Europeans arrived. Gao and the broader Songhai Empire had all of these things. They had them in abundance. And the proof still exists in libraries and private collections across West Africa, though many manuscripts were destroyed or stolen, which we'll get to. Now I need you to understand the timeline here because this is crucial. While Gao was flourishing as this cosmopolitan center of wealth and learning in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, what was happening in Europe? The Crusades were happening, which were basically religious wars, where Christians and Muslims slaughtered each other over control of Jerusalem. The Black Death was happening, which killed 1/3 of Europe's population. The 100 Years' War between England and France was happening. Europe was a violent, disease-ridden, relatively poor corner of the world. London didn't have street lighting until the 1400s. Paris was famous for how bad it smelled, because people threw their waste into the streets. Most Europeans couldn't read. Most European kings couldn't read. The printing press didn't exist until 1440. Universities existed, but were tiny and limited to clergy and nobility. Meanwhile, in Gao, you had a thriving multicultural city with international trade, widespread literacy, among the elite and merchant classes, advanced architecture, sophisticated legal systems, and accumulation of wealth that would make a modern billionaire jealous. The idea that Africans were sitting around in primitive conditions waiting for Europeans to civilize them is not just wrong, it's the exact opposite of reality. But Gao's golden age didn't last forever, and the story of how it fell, who destroyed it, and why they destroyed it, is where this history gets really dark and really relevant to your life today. To understand what happened to Gao, you need to understand one man. His name was Askia Muhammad, the firstborn Muhammad Toure, and he was one of the greatest kings in African history. Born in 1443 in the Songhai Empire, Muhammad Toure came from a military family. His mother was a sister, or possibly a cousin of Sunni Ali, who was the previous emperor and one of the great conquerors in West African history. Now Sunni Ali had built the Songhai Empire into a military powerhouse through decades of warfare. He conquered Timbuktu in 1468. He conquered Jenne after a 7-year siege in 1473. He expanded the empire's boundaries until Songhai controlled a territory larger than Western Europe, stretching from the Atlantic coast in the west to what is now Niger in the east, from the Sahara Desert in the north to the forests of modern-day Benin in the south. But when Sunni Ali died in 1492, there was a succession crisis. His son Sunni Baru took the throne, but only ruled for a few months before Muhammad Touré, who had been one of Sunni Ali's top generals, staged a coup and seized power. Muhammad Touré defeated Sunni Baru in battle in 1493 and declared himself Askia, which means the usurper or the forceful one. He became Askia Muhammad, the first founder of the Askia dynasty. Some people might see that as just another violent power grab, and yeah, it was. But what Askia Muhammad did after taking power transformed the Songhai Empire from a military state into one of the most sophisticated civilizations on the planet. First, he completely reorganized the government. Instead of ruling everything himself from the capital, he divided the empire into 4 viceroyalties, each governed by a regional administrator who reported directly to him. Under them were provincial governors. Under them were local chiefs. He created a professional bureaucracy with officials specializing in finance, military affairs, agriculture, and trade. He standardized the collection of taxes. He established a system of royal inspectors who would travel around the empire, making sure provincial governors weren't abusing their power or stealing from the treasury. This wasn't tribal chaos. This was imperial administration that would have impressed the Romans or the Chinese. Second, he professionalized the military. Instead of relying on temporary levies where farmers would be called up to fight when needed, Askia Muhammad created a standing army of full-time soldiers. At its peak, his army had roughly 100,000 men divided into multiple corps. The cavalry mounted on horses imported from North Africa were the elite shock troops. The infantry carried spears, swords, and bows. The river navy patrolled the Niger in war canoes that could carry up to 80 warriors each. He equipped his soldiers with the best weapons available in that era, including chainmail armor purchased from North African traders. He organized supply lines so his armies could campaign for months at a time. He established military training camps. This was a professional fighting force that could have gone toe-to-toe with any European army of the same period. Third, he revolutionized the economy. Askia Muhammad standardized weights and measures across the entire empire so that trade could flow smoothly. He established royal monopolies on the most valuable goods, particularly salt and gold, which meant the government controlled and taxed the most profitable aspects of trade. He minted coins with his name and title stamped on them, asserting the economic sovereignty of the empire. He negotiated trade agreements with Morocco, Egypt, and Libya. During his reign, the empire exported approximately 9 tons of gold per year through official channels. That's 18,000 pounds of gold annually. But the real wealth wasn't just in exports. The real wealth was in controlling the trade routes themselves. Every caravan that passed through Songhai territory paid taxes. Every merchant who sold goods in Gao's markets paid fees. Every transaction in the empire's cities generated revenue. Askia Muhammad became spectacularly, almost unimaginably wealthy. And in 1496 he decided to prove it to the world. In that year, Askia Muhammad embarked on a pilgrimage to Mecca, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and something every Muslim who is able is supposed to do at least once in their lifetime. But Askia Muhammad didn't just slip away quietly with a few companions. He organized a pilgrimage that became legendary across the Islamic world. His caravan consisted of 1,500 people, soldiers, scholars, servants, merchants, religious leaders. He brought 300,000 pieces of gold to distribute as charity along the way. He brought so many gifts and trade goods that it took hundreds of camels to carry them. When he passed through Cairo, the Mamluk Sultan hosted him with full honors. When he reached Mecca, he distributed gold so freely that he became famous throughout Arabia. While in Mecca and Cairo, Askia Muhammad met with the greatest Islamic scholars of his time. He asked them questions about governance, about Islamic law, about how to run an empire in accordance with religious principles. He recruited scholars to come back with him to Songhai, offering them generous salaries and positions at the universities in Timbuktu and Gao. He was appointed Caliph of Sudan, which was a largely honorary title, but gave him religious legitimacy throughout Muslim Africa. The Hajj, the pilgrimage, took 2 years. When Askia Muhammad returned to Gao in 1497, he brought with him scholars, architects, and books. Lots and lots of books. He immediately began a program of building mosques, expanding schools, and promoting Islamic scholarship throughout his empire. Under Askia Muhammad, Timbuktu became the intellectual capital of West Africa, but Gao remained the political and economic capital. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu had 25,000 students at its peak. Let me say that again, 25,000 students. That's larger than many modern universities. Students studied the Quran, Islamic law, rhetoric, grammar, logic, astronomy, mathematics, history, and geography. The libraries of Timbuktu and Gao collectively held an estimated 700,000 manuscripts. Some scholars put the number even higher. These manuscripts were written in Arabic, the scholarly language of the Islamic world, but also in Sudanic languages using the Arabic script. They covered every topic you can imagine. There are mathematical texts explaining algebra and geometry. There are astronomical charts showing the movements of stars and planets. There are medical treatises describing treatments for diseases and surgical procedures. There are historical chronicles documenting the reigns of kings and the events of each year. There are legal texts analyzing complex questions of Islamic jurisprudence. There are literary works, poetry, love stories, adventure tales. This was a literate scholarly culture producing and preserving knowledge on a massive scale. And it was happening in Black Africa, ruled by Black kings, taught by Black scholars, centuries before Europeans would colonize the continent and claim they were bringing civilization. Askia Muhammad ruled for 35 years, from 1493 to 1528. By the time he was overthrown by his own son in a palace coup, which was unfortunately common in this era, the Songhai Empire had reached its peak. It was the largest empire in African history up to that point, covering approximately 1.4 million square kilometers. It had a population of somewhere between 5 and 10 million people. It controlled the most important trade routes in West Africa. It had accumulated wealth that rivaled any kingdom in Europe or the Middle East. Askia Muhammad died in 1538 at the age of nearly 95, which was an incredible lifespan for that era. He was buried in Gao in a pyramidal tomb that still stands today. That tomb, the Tomb of Askia, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as one of the most important historical monuments in Africa. But here's what they don't teach you. Here's where the story gets deliberately erased. Everything I just described, the wealth, the power, the scholarship, the sophisticated government, all of it continued for another 60 years after Askia Muhammad died. His successors maintained the empire. The trade routes kept functioning. The universities kept teaching. The gold kept flowing. And then in 1591, everything came crashing down in one devastating military campaign that would change the course of African history. The man who destroyed the Songhai Empire was named Ahmad al-Mansur. He was the Sultan of Morocco, ruling the Saadi dynasty from his capital in Marrakech. And he wanted the gold of Songhai so badly, he was willing to risk everything to take it. By the late 1580s, Morocco had become a significant power in North Africa. Al-Mansur had defeated a Portuguese invasion at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir in 1578, which was one of the most important battles in African history because it ended Portuguese attempts to colonize Morocco. After that victory, Al-Mansur strengthened his military, modernized his administration, and looked for new sources of wealth to fund his ambitions. And he kept hearing about the gold. Caravans from Songhai would cross the Sahara, carrying gold bars, gold dust, gold coins. Merchants would come back from Timbuktu and Gao with stories of unimaginable wealth. Al-Mansur wanted that wealth. He wanted to control the gold mines. He wanted to control the trade routes. He wanted to tax the merchants. He wanted it all. But there was a problem. Between Morocco and Songhai lay the Sahara Desert, one of the most hostile environments on Earth. An army trying to cross the Sahara would face scorching heat during the day, freezing cold at night sandstorms that could bury men alive, and a total lack of water except at scattered oases. No large army had ever successfully crossed the Sahara to invade West Africa. Al-Mansur decided he would be the first, and he had a technological advantage that Songhai did not: guns. In the 1580s, firearms were beginning to revolutionize warfare around the world. The Ottoman Empire had used firearms to devastating effect. European armies were transitioning from medieval knights to gunpowder-based military forces. Morocco, because of its trade connections with both the Ottoman Empire and Europe, had acquired firearms and learned how to manufacture them. The Songhai Empire had not. Songhai's army still relied on traditional weapons like spears, swords, bows, and cavalry charges. They were brave. They were skilled. They were numerous. But they didn't have guns. In October 1590, Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur assembled an invasion force in Marrakech. The army consisted of approximately 4,000 soldiers. That doesn't sound like much, but this wasn't just any 4,000 soldiers. About half of them were armed with arquebuses, which were early matchlock firearms. Clumsy, slow to reload, not particularly accurate, but absolutely terrifying to anyone who had never faced them before. The army also included several small cannons transported on the backs of camels. The commander of this expedition was a man named Judar Pasha. He was born in Spain, captured as a child during raids on Christian territories, converted to Islam, and raised in the Moroccan court. He was chosen to lead the expedition, partly because of his military skill, and partly because as someone who wasn't ethnically Moroccan, he owed his position entirely to the Sultan, and therefore would be loyal. On October 16, 1590, Judar Pasha led his army out of Marrakech and into the Sahara. The crossing took 4 months. 4 months of marching through the most brutal desert on the planet. Men died of thirst. Men died of heat stroke. Men simply disappeared during sandstorms and were never seen again. Camels collapsed and died. Water supplies ran dangerously low multiple times. But Judar Pasha kept his army together. He followed ancient caravan routes from oasis to oasis. He hired local guides who knew where to find water. And in February 1591, the Moroccan army emerged from the Sahara on the northern edge of the Songhai Empire. News of the invasion reached Gao. The current emperor, Askia Ishak II, immediately began mobilizing the Songhai army. He gathered approximately 40,000 warriors, cavalry on horseback, infantry with spears and swords, archers. He had overwhelming numerical superiority. He had troops who knew the terrain. He had supply lines. He was confident he could crush this foreign invasion force. On March 13, 1591, the two armies met at a place called Tondibi. near the Niger River, not far from Gao. It was about to become one of the most one-sided battles in African history. Askia Ishak II deployed his 40,000 warriors in a massive formation. His strategy was simple and had worked for centuries. He would send in the cavalry to break the enemy line, then the infantry would pour through and overwhelm the survivors. He had done this before. His father had done this. His grandfather had done this. This was how Songhai fought and won battles. Judar Pasha deployed his 4,000 men in a much tighter formation. The soldiers with arquebuses formed ranks at the front. The cavalry stayed behind them. The cannons were positioned to cover the flanks. And they waited. Askia Ishak II gave the order to attack. But before sending his cavalry, he tried a tactic that had worked against previous enemies. He gathered about 1,000 cattle, tied burning branches to their horns, and drove them toward the Moroccan lines. The idea was that the burning cattle would panic the enemy horses and create chaos before the real attack began. It was a good plan. It had worked before. But the Moroccans didn't panic. When the cattle got within range, the Moroccan soldiers raised their arquebuses. On command, they fired. The sound of hundreds of guns discharging simultaneously echoed across the battlefield like thunder. Smoke filled the air, and the cattle, terrified by the noise and the smoke, turned around and stampeded back toward the Songhai lines. Chaos erupted in the Songhai army as burning cattle crashed through their ranks. Horses reared and threw their riders. Infantry scattered, trying to avoid being trampled. And while the Songhai lines were in confusion, Judar Pasha ordered a second volley of gunfire, aimed directly at the Songhai cavalry. Men fell, horses fell, blood sprayed. Warriors who had never heard a gun before in their lives suddenly faced a hail of lead balls tearing through armor and flesh. The psychological impact was devastating. Some Songhai soldiers broke and ran immediately. Others, braver or more stubborn, tried to advance through the gunfire. The Moroccan guns fired again and again. Slowly, methodically, the Moroccan soldiers loaded, aimed, and fired, cutting down anyone who came within range. The Songhai cavalry, which should have been the empire's greatest strength, became a liability as panicked horses made it impossible for warriors to coordinate attacks. Askia Ishak II, seeing his army beginning to disintegrate, tried to rally his troops. He rode forward shouting orders, trying to organize a coordinated charge that might overwhelm the Moroccans through sheer numbers. But his commanders were dying. His formations were collapsing, and the guns kept firing. Within hours, the Battle of Tondibi was over. The Songhai army had been routed. Approximately 8,000 Songhai warriors lay dead on the battlefield. The Moroccan army lost around 200 men, most of them in hand-to-hand fighting, after the initial volleys. Askia Ishak II fled south with the remnants of his army. Judar Pasha didn't pursue immediately. He didn't need to. The road to Gao lay open. On April 12, 1591, less than a month after the battle, the Moroccan army marched into Gao unopposed. The capital of the Songhai Empire, the city of gold, the center of West African wealth and learning, fell without another battle being fought, and then the looting began. For months, Moroccan soldiers systematically stripped Gao of its wealth. They entered the royal palace and seized the treasury: bars of gold, bags of gold dust, gold jewelry, gold ornaments. Everything was loaded onto camels to be sent back across the Sahara to Morocco. They confiscated the property of wealthy merchants. They took ownership of warehouses full of trade goods. They claimed the best houses for themselves and kicked the owners into the streets. But the destruction went far beyond just stealing money. The Moroccans targeted the intellectual heritage of the city. They burned libraries. Not all of them, but many. Thousands upon thousands of manuscripts went up in flames. Why? Because knowledge is power, and occupying armies destroy knowledge to break resistance. They arrested scholars. Some were killed. Others were forced to march across the Sahara to Morocco, where they would spend the rest of their lives as prisoners or servants in Moroccan households. Remember Ahmad Baba, the scholar I mentioned earlier, with 1,600 books. The Moroccans arrested him in Timbuktu in 1593, took him to Morocco in chains, confiscated his library, and held him prisoner for 14 years. They destroyed the palace. They smashed monuments. They defaced buildings. The message was clear. The Songhai Empire was over. Its culture was over. Its independence was over. Over the next few years, there were attempts at resistance. Askia Ishak II tried to rally support for a counterattack, but was assassinated by one of his own brothers in 1593. Other members of the royal family tried to claim the throne and organize resistance, but the empire had fragmented. Provincial governors declared independence. Different ethnic groups went their own way. The centralized state that Askia Muhammad had built disintegrated. By 1600, the Songhai Empire, as a political entity, had ceased to exist. The Moroccans controlled Gao and Timbuktu and the key trade routes, but they couldn't control the entire territory. They didn't have enough soldiers. The Sahara made resupply from Morocco difficult, and they faced constant rebellions from locals who hated the occupation. Over the decades, the Moroccan garrison in Gao became isolated. They intermarried with locals. They lost touch with Morocco. They effectively became a local warlord dynasty called the Arma, ruling over a shrunken territory around Gao and squeezing what wealth they could from the declining trade routes. But the real damage had been done. Gao went from a thriving city of nearly 100,000 people to a shadow of itself. The population plummeted. Trade routes shifted to the coast as Europeans began establishing trading posts in West Africa, buying goods directly from coastal kingdoms instead of relying on trans-Saharan caravans. The intellectual culture collapsed as scholars fled or died, and their students had no one to teach them. The libraries that weren't burned were scattered with manuscripts ending up in private collections or being sold off piece by piece. By the 1700s, Gao was a minor town. By the 1800s, it was nearly forgotten. When Europeans colonized West Africa in the late 19th century, they found ruins and heard vague stories about a great empire that once existed, but they dismissed those stories as myths or exaggerations. European colonial officials and scholars convinced themselves, or at least claimed to convince themselves, that Africans couldn't possibly have built such a civilization. And that brings us to the most important question of all. How did they erase Gao so completely that you've probably never heard of it until now? How did they take one of the greatest empires in medieval history and turn it into a footnote that most people don't know exists? Let me show you exactly how historical erasure works. They didn't just erase Gao. They erased dozens of African civilizations, hundreds of African achievements, thousands of African heroes. And they did it through a systematic, deliberate four-step process that we can document. This wasn't accidental. This was policy. This was necessary for their entire worldview to function. Step 1 was physical destruction. You can't claim something didn't exist if the evidence is still standing there for everyone to see. So they destroyed the evidence. When the Moroccans invaded Songhai in 1591, they didn't just conquer. They burned libraries containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. When Europeans colonized Africa in the 1800s, they looted archaeological sites and shipped artifacts back to Europe, where they disappeared into private collections or museum basements. When colonial governments built modern cities, they demolished ancient structures to make room for European-style buildings. The British Museum in London holds approximately 73,000 African artifacts. The Musée du Quai Branly in Paris holds around 70,000. Museums across Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and the United States hold tens of thousands more. These aren't items that were gifted or sold. These are items that were stolen during colonial conquest. Masks stolen from royal courts, sculptures stolen from temples, ancient texts stolen from libraries, historical records stolen from government archives. And when African nations ask for these items back, museums refuse. They claim the artifacts are world heritage and belong to humanity, not to specific countries, which is a fancy way of saying, we stole it, it's ours now, and we're not giving it back. Let me give you one specific example. In 1897, British forces invaded Benin City in what is now Nigeria. The Kingdom of Benin was an advanced West African state with sophisticated art architecture and metalworking traditions. When British soldiers entered the royal palace, they found thousands of bronze plaques and sculptures of incredible artistic quality. Some of these bronzes dated back to the 1400s. The British were shocked because these artworks were so sophisticated that they couldn't believe Africans had made them. Some British scholars literally claimed that the Benin bronzes must have been created by ancient Egyptians or Europeans, because black Africans supposedly lacked the technical skill to create such work. This was racist nonsense, but it was published in academic journals and taught in universities. The British soldiers looted about 3,000 bronze artworks from Benin City. They shipped them back to London, where they were sold at auction to collectors and museums. For over 100 years, the Benin bronzes have been displayed in European museums as examples of African primitive art, with no mention of the fact that they were stolen during a military invasion. Nigeria has been asking Britain to return the Benin bronzes since the 1960s. Britain refused for decades. Only in 2021 did some museums finally agree to begin returning some items, and the process is moving at a glacial pace. Meanwhile, British museums charge admission fees to see these stolen artifacts and sell postcards and souvenirs featuring African art that they have no rightful claim to. That's physical destruction and theft. They burn what they can, they steal what survives, and then they hide it in museums, where they can control the narrative about what it means. Step 2 is legal suppression. You use laws to make it illegal for colonized people to maintain their culture practice, their traditions, or even speak their own languages. When France colonized West Africa, including the territories that had once been part of the Songhai Empire, they implemented a policy called assimilation. The idea was that Africans would become French in culture, language, and loyalty. To accomplish this, French colonial authorities made it illegal to teach African languages in schools. Students caught speaking their native languages instead of French were punished, sometimes severely. Imagine being a child whose grandparents spoke Songhai, whose parents spoke Songhai, who grew up speaking Songhai, and then being told that your language is forbidden. You have to speak French now. Your language is primitive. Your language has no value. Your language is a sign of your backwardness. That's cultural genocide. That's deliberately cutting off generations from their heritage. If you can't speak the language your ancestors spoke, you can't read the old manuscripts, even if you find them. You can't understand the oral histories. You lose connection to your culture. The British did the same thing in their African colonies. So did the Portuguese. So did the Belgians. Every colonial power used education as a weapon to erase indigenous culture and replace it with European culture. But language suppression was just the beginning. Colonial governments also passed laws seizing land from Africans. In Kenya, the British Crown Land Ordinance of 1902 declared that all land belonged to the British Crown, unless Africans could prove legal ownership with written deeds. Since most African land ownership was based on traditional systems that didn't use European-style legal documents, This law effectively allowed the British to steal millions of acres. In the Belgian Congo, King Leopold II issued decrees declaring that all supposedly unoccupied land belonged to him personally. Since Africans lived in villages and towns and didn't occupy every square mile of territory, Leopold claimed the entire Congo as his private property. He then leased it to private companies who extracted rubber, ivory, and minerals using forced labor that killed an estimated 10 million Congolese people. These weren't random acts of cruelty. These were legal policies enacted by governments and enforced by police and military. The law was used as a weapon to steal land, destroy culture, and justify exploitation. And here's where it connects to Gao specifically. When France colonized Mali, they deliberately divided the territory in ways that split up ethnic groups and historical regions. The old Songhai heartland was divided between French Sudan, which became Mali, and French Niger, which became Niger. This made it harder for people to maintain a unified cultural identity connected to the old empire. The French also used a system called direct rule in some areas and indirect rule in others. In direct rule areas, French officials governed directly and imposed French law. In indirect rule areas, they appointed local chiefs to govern on behalf of France. But these chiefs were chosen for their loyalty to France, not for their legitimacy in traditional systems. This corrupted African political structures and made it easier to control populations. Step 3 is educational erasure. You control what children learn so that they grow up not knowing their own history. In French colonies, children were taught that their ancestors were the Gauls, the ancient Celtic people who lived in what is now France before the Romans conquered them. African children would sit in classrooms and recite our ancestors, the Gauls, in French, even though they had no genetic or cultural connection to ancient Gauls whatsoever. They were taught European history in detail: the Roman Empire, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the French Revolution, Napoleon, World Wars. But African history either completely ignored or reduced to a few sentences about primitive tribes living in jungles before Europeans arrived to civilize them. British colonial schools did the same thing. Students in Nigeria learned about Henry VIII and Queen Victoria and the Battle of Waterloo. But they learned nothing about the Kingdom of Benin that existed in their own country. They learned nothing about the Songhai Empire. They learned nothing about Great Zimbabwe. They learned nothing about the Kingdom of Kush. They were taught that African history began when Europeans showed up. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate colonial policy designed to make Africans ashamed of their heritage and grateful for European civilization. If you grow up believing your ancestors were primitives who lived in mud huts and worshipped trees, you won't resist colonial rule. You'll think colonization was actually a good thing because it brought you civilization. The erasure wasn't limited to colonial schools. European and American universities taught the same lies. In 1963, a British historian named Hugh Trevor Roper, who was a professor at Oxford University, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, said this in a lecture. Perhaps in the future there will be African history to teach, but at present there is none, or very little. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is largely darkness, and darkness is not a subject for history. This was 1963, not 1863, not during the colonial era, but 1963 after most African nations had gained independence. A professor at Oxford was still teaching that African history didn't exist, and his textbooks were used to teach students all over Europe and America. This kind of racist academic garbage influenced generations of students who grew up believing Africa had no history. It influenced textbook writers who left Africa out of world history curricula. It influenced museum curators who displayed African artifacts as curiosities instead of as historical treasures. It influenced filmmakers who portrayed Africa as a land of savages. It influenced every aspect of how the world viewed Africa and African people. American textbooks were just as bad. Through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 1980s, most American history textbooks mentioned Africa only in the context of the slave trade. The narrative was simple. Europeans discovered Africa. Africans were primitive. Europeans enslaved Africans and brought them to America. Then there was a civil war. Then slavery ended. The end. There was no mention of African kingdoms, no mention of African empires, no mention of African achievements in art, architecture, science, mathematics, literature. Nothing. Just primitive tribes and slavery. This meant that Black American children grew up learning that their ancestors were slaves, and nothing more. There was no great civilization to be proud of, no great kings to look up to, no great achievements to inspire them. Just slavery and oppression and victimhood. That's a devastating psychological burden to put on children, and it's a lie, a complete and total lie. But it was taught as fact for generations. UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, finally started to address this problem in the 1960s. They launched a massive project called the General History of Africa, hiring African scholars to write a comprehensive history of the continent from African perspectives. The first volume was published in 1981, 8 volumes covering all of African history, from prehistory to modern times. But how many American schools use the UNESCO General History of Africa? Almost none. How many European schools? Almost none. The erasure continues even today, because the systems that created the erasure are still in place. Step 4 is media manipulation. You control the images and stories people see so that they internalize racist stereotypes without even realizing it. Hollywood has been one of the most powerful tools of African historical erasure. For decades, movies set in Africa portrayed the continent as a jungle full of dangerous animals and primitive tribes. Tarzan movies showed a white man as the king of the jungle, more civilized and intelligent than the Africans who lived there. Adventure movies showed white explorers bravely venturing into darkest Africa to discover things that Africans already knew existed. Even movies that weren't explicitly racist still reinforced stereotypes. Africa was always shown as primitive, backward, dangerous, diseased. African characters were servants, comic relief, or savages. There were no African kings unless they were villains. There were no African scholars. There were no African cities, just jungles and villages and drums. This continued well into the late 20th century. The movie The Gods Must Be Crazy from 1980 portrayed an African tribe as so primitive they'd never seen modern technology. The Air Up There from 1994 was about a white American going to Africa to recruit a basketball player from a tribe. Even The Lion King, which millions of children watched, portrayed Africa through the eyes of animals with no human civilization in sight, except for a wise monkey. It wasn't until recently, with movies like Black Panther in 2018, that Hollywood finally showed an African civilization as advanced and powerful. And do you know what the reaction was? A lot of people said it was unrealistic. They said Wakanda could never exist in Africa. They said African societies could never be that technologically advanced. Why? Because they'd been taught their entire lives that Africa equals primitive. But Wakanda isn't unrealistic. Wakanda is actually pretty close to what empires like Songhai actually were. Wealthy, powerful, sophisticated, with their own technology and culture and achievements. The only unrealistic part of Wakanda is the vibranium meteor. The idea that Africans could build an advanced civilization without outside help. That's not science fiction. That's historical fact. Museums also played a role in erasure. When European museums displayed African artifacts, they labeled them as primitive art or tribal crafts. They displayed them next to prehistoric tools and Stone Age weapons, creating the impression that Africans were stuck in an earlier stage of human development. Meanwhile, European and Asian artifacts were displayed as fine art and sophisticated craftsmanship. The message was clear. White and Asian people create art. Black people create crafts. White and Asian civilizations are sophisticated. Black civilizations are primitive. This was reinforced visually in museum after museum, exhibition after exhibition, for over a century. National Geographic magazine, which millions of people read as an educational resource, spent decades portraying Africa through a very specific lens. Photos of topless African women. Photos of tribal ceremonies with warriors in traditional dress. Photos of animals and landscapes. But very few photos of African cities, African universities, African businesses, African middle-class families living modern lives. The effect was to freeze Africa in time, to make readers think that all Africans lived in villages, wore traditional clothing, practiced ancient rituals, and had no connection to the modern world. This wasn't true even when those magazines were published, but it was the image they sold. Television news coverage reinforced the same stereotypes. When American and European news networks covered Africa, they focused almost exclusively on poverty, disease, war, famine, and disaster. Every story was about how terrible things were in Africa and how much Africans needed help from white saviors. Positive stories about African innovation, African success, African achievement, almost never covered. The narrative was always the same. Africa is a basket case. Africans can't govern themselves. Africans need white people to save them. This matters because media shapes how people think. If all you ever see of Africa is negative images, you start to believe Africa is nothing but negative. If all you ever hear is that Africans are primitive and backward, you start to believe it even if you consciously reject racism. And this connects directly back to Gao and the Songhai Empire. If people understood that West Africa had produced empires that rivaled anything in Europe, that Black Africans had built universities, that African kings controlled more gold than European monarchs, they couldn't maintain these racist stereotypes. The entire justification for colonialism, for slavery, for ongoing racial inequality would fall apart. That's why Gao had to be erased. That's why Songhai had to be forgotten. That's why African history had to be reduced to slavery and colonialism and nothing else. Because the truth is too dangerous. The truth is that Black people built civilizations. The truth is that Africans were wealthy and sophisticated and powerful. The truth is that European dominance in Africa is recent and was achieved through violence, not superiority. And if people understood those truths, they'd start asking uncomfortable questions. They'd ask why Black communities today have so little wealth when their ancestors controlled gold mines. They'd ask how European museums got all those African artifacts, if not through theft. They'd ask whether the wealth of Europe and America was built on African gold and African labor. They'd ask whether the poverty in Africa today is the result of colonialism, not inherent inferiority. Those are dangerous questions for people in power. So they buried the evidence. They rewrote the textbooks. They controlled the images. They made sure that most people, including most Black people, never learned the real history. But here's the thing. The truth doesn't disappear just because they tried to hide it. The manuscripts still exist, at least some of them. The archaeological sites are still there. The oral histories were passed down. And now slowly, the truth is coming back to light.